Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I'm Piyush Agarwal, Advanced Certified App Developer, and in this video we are going with the understanding about the Robotic Enterprise Framework. So in the last two videos, we have learned about the initialization and get transaction stage. Now we are moving further to the process transaction. So the bot will reach to the process transaction state only when the transaction item is not set as nothing, which we have learned properly into the previous video. Now let's move into the process transaction. So what happens in the process transaction stage? As mentioned on the top, the results of the processing can be success, business exception, system exception. In case of a system exception, the transaction can be automatically retried. So let's scroll down. Over here we have got a try catch again to handle any kind of error that may occur inside the process. We are setting the business exception as nothing in the before initializing any new transaction. And if you would have focused properly, you might have observed that in the initialization stage we have set the system exception as nothing. Okay, then we have got our process.xaml over here. If I open it, it is blank. There's nothing over here. So all the process steps that you want to in your process, in your automation bot, you would include that over here. So let's say for it's a very simple example. You are taking two input values from a user and then you want to sum them up. So taking values is an input, summing up them is a process, and when you return that back to the user, that is an output. So over here, the action that you would perform would be to sum the input values. That would be the part which will come in the process element. Now, if we take it from a more complex scenario, a little bit more, a real-time process. So you all might have seen the RPA challenge website, generally used for all the learning videos. So the part where you are entering all the values for each specific field, could be name, last name, email, all those things would come up over here in this process.xaml. So the bot will fetch the data from outside, from the get transaction stage, and fill up the form in this process stage and click on submit. Now if you see the arguments, by default you would have two arguments, in config and in transaction item. Now, if you are using the transaction items through the queue, then let it remain to queue item. If you want it as a data row, you can change it over here as system.data row. Data row would be used if you are, instead of queues, you are working with Excel. And if you want, if you have created some other variables, like again in the previous video we saw about like creating transaction field 1 or 2 to identify the entry that you are working on something uniquely, what you can do, you can simply create new variables over arguments over here. Let's say to transaction field 1, or I can name it in unique number, anything, and provide this argument type. Once done, so once this process.xaml is completed, then it moves outside over here. Now there is one specific thing you need to focus while working with the process.xaml. I would recommend not using try catch inside the process.xaml unless you exactly know how to handle that error. Let's say for example, there is a business exception that is coming inside your process flow. Just throw the exception. Don't try to handle it within this process.xaml if you don't know the exact scenario what you need to do. Or I would say, like, if there is a system application exception, like for some reason your application is not open, so what you just need to do nothing. Okay, because you cannot handle that error that is coming explicitly somewhere unknowingly. So once that exception would occur, that would be handled outside inside this main try catch. Okay, then Let's see what we have got next. Over here, either you can keep this over here, try catch, if in case of success it would run. And let's say if there is a business exception, then you have got your business exception variable set as exception, and then you're again try catch what you want inside the invoke set transaction status XML if a business exception has occurred. Similarly for exception, if there is an exception, then set transaction XML. So personally, I don't prefer going through this scenario using this approach. Okay, this is the new RE framework that is being used. What I prefer personally is I won't recommend using this over here. Try catch inside the same things for this one. We can set it to nothing, and same for here. So instead of keeping it over here, you can just put it inside the finally activity. That's what I personally recommend. So in the try block, we are running a process.xaml. If a business exception has occurred, you can set the business exception variable. Same for the system exception. And now when you are moving to into the finally block, it would run the set transaction status XAML. And inside this XAML, you can figure out what kind of exception or success scenarios occur. Like the first uh, decision flow would check if it is a successful scenario. Yes, then run the success sequence. Then check is there a business exception. If yes, then run it. And if it is a system exception, then run the system exception log. That way, based on the exception, you would be able to identify and do the respective thing that you want to do. So let me explain this set transaction status from starting. So in this one, in as an argument, multiple fields would come. The major thing that you would need is the type of exception or the success scenario, the config variable in case you want to update some kind of status file. Again, in the previous video, as I mentioned about a start time variable to update our consolidated report with the exact time that is being done, that you can invoke over here in the success, business exception, and system exception sequence. Let's start with success. So over here, this is set based on a queue item. If in transaction item is not nothing and it is a queue item type, then do this process and then log that your process had completed successfully. So, but if you are removing the transaction item instead of queue to a data row, you don't really need this particular activity. You can disable it or remove it and update your activities, whatever you want to do on success over here. Generally prefer not to add any kind of actions which include which are have a possibility to fail. Okay, like for example, you are clicking on certain UI selector. Now there is a chance that the selectors might change in future, so don't add those activities over here. But if it is something like more something which is more likely not to fail, okay, something like you are adding some data into a text file or an Excel file or sending an email, those things you can add over here or generally followed. That's the approach generally followed in the corporate. Then comes business exception. Same over here, you can disable this part if you want and add any logic over here. One more thing that you can add, just my personal best practice. Over here, you can create two variables within each sequence. And let's say one called remark and one is called status. So with status, you can set if it is a business exception, it is a success or application exception. And in the remark, if it is a business exception, then you can store its message in this one. Then it like this. So if you configure your framework with this approach, you would be easily able to modify or use this remark and status through the status, business exception, and system exception sequence inside your consolidated report XAML, or anyway if you are logging these entries. Then one another thing to know, that if a success or business exception occur, then your transaction number would increase to the next one. IO transaction number equals to IO transaction number plus one, and set the retry count and consecutive exception to 0. Because over in these two scenarios, what you are saying, if success, yes, the work is done for this transaction, now move on to the next one. If business, I am unable to solve or complete this transaction because there is some error on the input end. Something from the business end. Bot's logic is correct, but the input provided to it is incorrect. So I am moving on to the next one. But when we come to system exception, then what happens? We over here we are going to retry that particular exception. Now again in this one can be disabled, and the retry mechanism comes under this retry current transaction. So in this one, there are a few things to check. First, if the retry transaction number is greater than 0, it is fetched from the config file. If it is not greater than 0, then simply move on to the next transaction. But if yes, it is greater than 0, then check if the max retries have reached. Okay, if the retry, let's say the maximum retries is on 2 and the max retry number set in the config is 3, so it is 2 less than equals to 3, false. So it will try to again try the same transaction. But if it has reached the maximum, like both the values are same or greater than, then it will simply move on to the next transaction. Now another thing, again, if we are difference between queue and using the normal iterations, if you are not using a queue retry, you can remove these activities, this, and this. You can delete if you are not using a queue retry, and you can simply put it over here like this, because in this state you are retrying the same transaction. You don't need to update that IO transaction number. Okay, and if you are using a queue retry, then it would depend based on your queue, if you can retry this transaction or not. If you can retry this transaction, then what will happen, it will set IO retry number to +1. If queue retry value is yes, then it will move on to the next transaction. And then the rest part is try closing applications. Again, if it is a system exception, you will first try to close all the everything on which is on your system, and do a fresh start from the beginning for that, from that particular transaction only. Okay, so that was for the set transaction status XAML. If it fails, it is going to simply log a message. So just always and again one more thing, if it fails the set transaction status XAML, then your transaction number won't be updated. It would remain like, if it is on 2, it will remain on 2, and thus your bot will go in an infinite loop. So always make sure that your anything that you put inside the try catch is generally which is less likely to fail. And the once you are completed with the transaction, based on your status, like if it is success, if it is business exception or system exception, your state will move to the next state. Like if it is status or business exception, then bot will move from process transaction to the get transaction data stage. But if it is a system exception, then bot will restart from the beginning, from the initialization state. The only thing which would be different, that this time it is not going to invoke the init all settings XAML, because config variable is not set as nothing. Hope you guys understand this video. You were able to understand the use of the system exceptions, business exceptions, and how to work with the process transaction state. For sure, if you have got any doubts, any confusions, You can mention it in the comments. Do like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And in the next video, we are going to go through the end process stage, and we've got a lot more to learn in the RE framework. Okay, guys, see you in the next video.